Okay, hi. This is Danielle Karapkin speaking to you from Thornhill, Ontario at the Bayit Beit Avraham Yosef of Toronto. And we are studying Moreh Nevukhim on behalf of webyeshiva.org. And we invite you to check out all of the courses that are being offered on Web Yeshiva, as well as on the Bayit's YouTube channel. We are up to section 3 in Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed. We are in chapter 18. And we are discussing divine providence, how it is that God interacts not only in a mindful way, but in an interventive and interactive way with the goings on of our world. The last 2 weeks, we studied chapter 17, which talked about all of the different ancient beliefs having to do with divine providence. And I guess before going any further, I should say that our Torah study today should be in the merit of all of Am Yisrael, of all the Jewish people, that we should stay safe and be victorious in this very, very difficult battle that we are fighting right now in the land of Israel. And it certainly is a timely conversation because we are faced always with the difficult dilemma, the seeming contradiction of the presence of evil being allowed to prevail in the world, and yet at the same time being of the belief that God intervenes and is completely knowledgeable and providential of what goes on in our world. And so the last thing that we saw is the opinion of the Rambam. We refer you back to chapter 17 to see the other opinions, most notably that of Aristotle, who believed that while divine providence exists, it only exists with the creations of God that are eternal creations, such as the celestial spheres. But because everything in our terrestrial realm, by definition, is given to the vicissitudes of time, is not eternal, is only temporary. Therefore, God's providence does not extend to things that are only temporary in existence, things that are born and change and eventually die. God's unchanging sentience does not extend to those things. God is not providential of anything that is given to change. The Rambam, of course, recognizes that this is completely untenable and irreconcilable with the ideas of the Torah, which discuss reward and punishment for human behavior. And therefore, the Rambam is forced to conclude that God is completely providential of the going-ons of mankind, and therefore develops a completely different system whereby God's providence extends to human beings, despite the fact that we are temporary creations. And that is that the Rambam is of the belief, based on his knowledge of Aristotle, that the human intellect, the human mind, is subject to be receiving what we call divine overflow, some kind of benevolent overflow of God's presence into the human mind, which is what gives human beings their endowed intellect, sort of like those eureka moments that we have in life that allow us to realize things that we might not have been able to realize on our own. Not really a prophecy, but almost like an aha moment where, because we develop our intellects to the greatest extent that we can, we are able to receive certain intellectual endowments from heaven. That connection that is created between heaven and earth via the intellect is also the connection that is created to allow God to peer into man's life and intervene into the daily goings on of the human experience. But because that conduit that is created between our terrestrial realm and the divine realm is via human intellect, only the human being is subject to that kind of divine providence. The rest of creation is maintained by God in the sense that God allows the laws of nature to govern everything that happens in this world. But there is no individual, what we would call in Hebrew, hashgacha pratit, individual attentive providence to every single component of creation. God, therefore, is not providential of every single blade of grass and of every single insect, but rather consigns laws. God put into motion laws of nature and allows those laws to govern how insects and animals and vegetation grow, mutate, age, wither, die, etc. That's the view of the Rambam. Now, before we go into the topic of this chapter, first of all, I'm going to bring up my screen and I'm going to share with you um, uh, this handout, which is entitled Every Person Has Unique Providence, can be easily downloaded from the Facebook group Shiur in Moreh Nevukhim, or you can get it from the webyeshiva.org website in the course description of today's lecture. The basic premise of both chapter 17 and the chapter that we're doing today, chapter 18, is providence is consequent upon the intellect and attached to it. Now, not all commentaries, before we go on, not all commentaries agree with the Rambam that divine providence is limited to human beings. Take a look, for example, at this midrash that seems to present a completely different view. And this is quoted by a number of Jewish philosophers who wish to take issue with the Rambam. It states, Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai v'Rabbi Elazar Berei havu temirin b'mararta yud gimel shana. The famous story of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai and his son, who were hidden in a cave, evading the Roman authorities for 13 years. And they would only survive on eating caribs, and this caused their bodies to have a negative reaction. It formed sort of like a scab over their bodies. L'sov shalosh esrei shenin nafik yativ al tara ma'arta, and after 13 years, Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai emerges from the cave and stands at the mouth of the cave. Chama chad sayad koim v'tzayed siporin, and he sees, one of the first things that he sees is a hunter hunting birds. V'kad havashama Reb Shimon birat kala amra min shemaya demos pascha. And Rabbi Shimon was so finely attuned to the spiritual realm after having been in solitude for those 13 years, he heard a heavenly voice saying from heaven, Demos Pascha, that this bird is meant to be trapped. V'chad havashama brat kala amart safkula hava mitatzda v'nilkeda. And when he would hear a heavenly voice saying sipkula, which is another Greek word, he knew that that bird was going to be trapped. V'nilkeda. Amar tzipor mi baladei shemaya lo mitzada alachat kama v'kama nefesh de barnash. I'm sorry, the word demos means freedom. So when he would hear a heavenly voice say free, he knew that that bird was going to be freed, would be able to evade the hunter. But when he heard a heavenly voice saying sapkula, which is a word for trapped or condemned, he said, oh, I know that this bird is going to be trapped. So he said, we see from here that every single bird, it is decided which one will be trapped and which one will be freed. If that's true about birds, how much more so is it true about human beings? The Rambam does not accept this theologically because this midrash seems to imply that God determines the fate of each and every individual bird that's flying in the air, whether it will live, whether it will die, whether it will be trapped by the hunter, or whether it will be able to go free. But it is important to note that a number of commentaries point to this midrash and say that based on this medrash, you see that even non-human creatures, non-human creations of God are subject to individual divine providence. So, and the Radak actually makes this point in his commentary to Tehillim, chapter 145. He says, talking about Ki b'tzedek u'b'yosher notein l'kol echad ochlo. This is from the Ashrei, where it talks about Tzaddik Hashem b'chol derachav v'chasid b'chol ma'asav, that God is righteous in all his ways. And the reason that God is righteous, says the Radak, is because God provides to each living creature what its needs are. He says, even though one animal attacks another, like a cat attacking a mouse, Usha'ara chayot ha'ochlot chayot acherot. And we have other predator creatures like lions and bears and leopards. V'chein b'ma'ofefim, and the same thing with birds of prey. Hakol tzedek me'ito. Nonetheless, everything is done by divine justice from God. Ki gam lichyot ula'ofot hanitrafim noten lehem gam kein ma'achalam b'chayehem. God provides every living creature its needs. So, and then I'm just going to skip a couple of lines. He says, this is a big controversy among the wise men. There are some of our sages who say that when a lion mauls a sheep, this docile animal, then that is a decree from God. It is actually a punishment to the sheep that it is getting killed by a lion. And I seem to see a source for this, as it says in the Talmud in Tractate Chulin, Rabbi Yochanan Kadhabi Chazi Shalach Sheshole Dagim Hayam. When Rabbi Yochanan would see a type of predator bird, usually it's translated as a stork, he would see it, or some other, or a crane, would be pulling fish from the ocean, Haya Omer, Mishpatecha Tahom Rabbah, that this is part of your justice, your unfathomable justice, O God. Umehem Omrim, Ki En Gemul Va'onesh B'chol Minei HaChayim Ela La'adam Bilvad. And there are others who say, and here he's citing the Rambam, and as we'll see the Ramban as well, that reward and punishment are extended only to human beings. V'anachnu nomar yesh gemul va'onesh lishar minei ba'alei chayim be'esek ha'adam. But I say, says the Radak, that there is divine justice extended to every single living creature because of man. In other words, because all of creation exists due to the human experience, God created all animals and vegetation for the sake of man. Therefore, since divine justice extends to man, it extends to animals and all other creatures as well for the sake of man. Ki hine matzanu miyad kol chaya edrashenu. Okay, and he continues further and forth and further in this discussion. He says, therefore, melamed she'ein hakadosh baruch hu mekapech schar kol beriya uvriya. He says we see from here that God does not withhold the reward of any living creature, but he does say that it's for the sake of man. Now, we also find the same thing stated in Hasidic literature. This is extensive. One of the examples is from Reb Chaim Tzanzer, the Tzanzer Rav. You can see that at the beginning of his commentary to Parshat Miketz. He says, Ki hinei Hashem eino el yire'av v'huzan u'mefarnes lakol, that God is, his eyes are upon everything, and he sustains every living creature. Umanhig ha'olam b'chasdo, v'i efshar l'shum nivra lichiot bilti shahaborei kvodo, I'm not sure what that abbreviation is, mechayev v'zan oto. No creature can exist without God sustaining it. V'hakol b'hashkacha, and everything is by divine providence. Hagam shaharambam zal dat acheret lo bazeh, even though Maimonides has a different opinion, aval be'emet lefi dat chazal afilu tzipor lo nitzaod bilti hashkacha milamala. But really, according to our sages, no singular individual bird can be hunted and trapped without divine providence on that particular bird. And he writes the same thing essentially as the Radak, and that is, why does divine providence extend to birds? Not necessarily because God cares about that individual non-sentient or really non-thinking bird, but rather because all of creation exists for the sake of man. And because man is subject to divine individual providence, therefore everything within man's purview, down to the lowliest insect, is subject to divine providence as well. Now that we've established this idea that there is this machloket, there is this dispute between the Rambam and other authorities as to whether divine providence extends to other creatures besides human beings. But we've clearly established that for the Rambam, this idea of hashgacha pratit, individual divine providence, extends only to beings of intellect, to human beings. The Rambam's emphasis now in chapter 18 is that because different people have different intellects, each person's providence is as unique as each person's intellect and connection to God. And I want to make a point. We've said this many times before. The Rambam acknowledges that different people have different intellectual achievements based both on nature and nurture. Every human being is born with an intellectual capacity, but every single human being works at different levels to perfect whatever God-given intellectual talents they have. Some people can be born with great intellect, but they waste their time on video games and movies and stuff like that, and they don't end up becoming the great intellect that they were meant to be. There are other people who are endowed with lesser intellect, but because they put in extreme effort into developing whatever they do have, they are able to achieve more intellectually. Based on those two things, nature and nurture, each person will have a unique level of intellectual connection to God with this principle of divine overflow. And that means that there are no two people who have the same type of providence, the way that God looks over their lives and peers into their lives. If a person is intellectually detached, meaning they haven't developed their intellect, God takes less interest and is less interventive in that person's life. The more intellectually developed I am, the more interventive and involved God is within my life. The first thing that the Rambam wishes to establish in discussing this chapter is to dispel the notion that existed within certain philosophy circles, including Aristotle, that there's an idea of God maintaining a species. We first established that the whole notion of species, that's a mental construct. It is not something that exists ontologically in reality, that because we are all part of one species, we are all endowed with the same thing. The Rambam wants to make a point of saying is that each human being is unique, is sui generis, and an individual. And therefore, each human intellect that is placed within each individual human being is completely different and separate and disparate from every other human being. Now, this is a very interesting discussion, but which has very modern applications as well, as I'll get to in just a moment. But the reason why this is relevant for the Rambam is because he wants to make sure that we understand that there's no such thing as this generic universal intellect that is endowed to all human beings in the same way. That would imply that every human being is subject to the same level of divine providence as well. So the Rambam says, no, it doesn't work that way. Yes, we all share in common human characteristics, just like insects, like ants, all have the same characteristics of being an ant. But each ant is an individual ant. Some are larger, some are smaller, some have a certain kind of propensity, some have less, some are born with more ant-like characteristics than others. Similarly, human beings are all unique. Why do we assign human beings as being part of the same species? That's to help us get our heads around the constructs of this world. But in reality, the whole idea of species, the term species, of sort of categorizing in genera and species, different kinds of creatures of this world, that's just a mental construct to help us understand the world, but it's not something that exists in reality. This is something that's been debated up until the Common Age. I'm just quoting from an article having to do with Darwin's evolutionary theory. For Charles Darwin, species was an undefinable term, one arbitrarily given for the sake of convenience to a set of individuals closely resembling each other. That hasn't stopped scientists in the 150 years since then from trying, however. When scientists today sit down to study a new form of life, They apply any number of more than 70 definitions of what constitutes a species, and each helps get at a different aspect of what makes organisms distinct. In a way, the plethora of definitions helps prove Darwin's point. The idea of a species is ultimately a human or mental construct. With advancing DNA technology, scientists are now able to draw finer and finer lines between what they consider species by looking at the genetic code that defines them. How scientists choose to draw that line depends on whether their subject is an animal or plant, the tools available, and the scientist's own preference and expertise. But since there is no such thing as a universal human intellect, but rather each human is endowed with a unique intellect whose characteristics are more or less similar to other humans. As such, and this is the point that the Rambam wishes to make here, providence, which is linked to intellect, is unique to each human, and providence is graded as just as their human perfection is graded. The more human I am, the more developed my intellect is, which according to the Rambam is the defining feature of humanity. That goes back to the very first chapter of Moreh Nevukhim, of what it means to be created in the image of God. That's the definition of humanity, is intellect. And as such, the more I am human, the more intellect that I have developed, the more I am privy to hashgacha pratit, to this divine providence. Now, I just want to make an interesting point. The Rambam must concede that God is providential to each and every species of living creature other than the human being. Individual divine providence extends to each and every individual human being based on their intellect. But what will we say about the ants and about the mosquitoes and about the tigers and the lions and all of the other different species who all share the same types of genetic characteristics, all of the different features of that unique animal? Do we not say, like Aristotle had said in chapter 17, that there is some kind of general divine providence to maintain each species? So if the Rambam says that species is not a real thing, it's just a mental construct, then how does God's divine providence work to other species other than humankind? And the answer that we have to conclude is that God allows something that we call nature to sort of, or let's say the laws of physics, the laws of science, to govern how things continue to propagate. God sort of supervises nature to make sure that the laws of science are not running amok, and that there's a general maintenance of the laws of physics to continue running. But as far as God dictating what each individual creature is going to do with its life, whether it's going to live a short life or a long life, whether it's going to have a lot of offspring or very few offspring, all of those things are not subject to divine providence. God is not mindful of other creatures, according to the Rambam. And so just wanted to make that point. Number two, this being the case, that each human being has a separate level of intellect and therefore has a separate level of divine providence, we must differentiate greatly between different kinds of human beings. So he therefore says prophets and righteous people enjoy a far greater level of providence than ignorant and evil people whose intellects are much lower. Such people may not enjoy a providence that is that much higher than that of animals. So what the Rambam is making a very, very dramatic statement here. And he says that if a human being sort of spends their life being animalistic, not developing their intellect, but rather, just maintaining, just a very unintellectually stimulated life that really does not involve a lot of thought and a lot of development of personhood, then that human being will be subject to a minimal level of divine providence, probably not that much different from any individual animal. Scripture says about such people in Psalms chapter 49, Idam bikar velo yavin, that a person may take pride in his wealth, as the Metzudas David explains, but velo yavin, he still doesn't understand, and therefore, nimshal kabehemot nidmu, such a person can be compared to animals because they don't take an effort to be discerning, to be mevin, and to have an intellectual understanding of themselves and the world around them. So therefore, such a person may be wealthy, but they are still treated like animals, and they are left basically to the sort of the vicissitudes, the winds of just chance. For this reason, executions of such people is not as serious as human murder, which is why it is at times commanded by the Torah. And this is sort of frightening, because what the Rambam is essentially suggesting is, and we have to really take this with a grain of salt, is that certain people's life is not as valuable as other people's lives, depending upon how developed their intellects is. Now, this is extremely dangerous rhetoric if misused, because typically we see the Talmud saying just the opposite, that no human being's blood is any redder than any other human being's. But the Rambam says, what is the whole justification for killing human beings? When does the Torah justify killing human beings? It justifies the killing of human beings when a person is deemed to be guilty of capital punishment. And therefore, the Torah says there are certain people that it is a mitzvah to kill. And the Rambam's understanding of that is that because certain sins that people commit cause them to lose their humanity, cause them to lose their human characteristics, which is the sort of the basis for the preservation of their life. But when a person loses their humanity, they no longer deserve to be treated with the same dignity of a human being, and therefore they deserve sometimes either we are not as caring about the sanctity of that life, or we are even commanded to actually remove that life, to take that life, because that person has committed something that is offensive and dangerous to the rest of the Jewish community. I go back to the Rambam's comments all the way back in section 1, chapter 54, where the Rambam talks about what the definition of a good leader is, a good political leader. He says, at times and towards some persons, this leader must be merciful and gracious, not only from motives of mercy and compassion, but according to their merits. At other times and towards other persons, he must evince anger, revenge, and wrath in proportion to their guilt, but not from motives of passion. In other words, the truly righteous leader is not motivated by emotion, but rather by justice. He must be able to condemn a person to death by fire without anger, passion, or loathing against him, and must exclusively be guided by what he perceives of the guilt of the person and by a sense of the great benefit which a large number will derive from such a sentence. Meaning that sometimes the Torah says, "Uvi'arta hara mikirbecha," remove the evil that is within your midst. And in so doing, you will help preserve the rest of the community that would be corrupted by the evil that that person represents. And so therefore, you shall not think that this commandment implies an act of cruelty and retaliation when the Torah tells you to eliminate certain evil beings from your community. It is an act that is demanded by the tendency of man to remove everything that might turn him away from the right path and to clear away all obstacles in the road to perfection, that is, to the knowledge of God. And therefore, the Rambam, at least what he seems to be saying over here is that some people lose because they've lost their humanity, because they've committed certain sins which sort of go completely against their intellectual perfection. That's the reason why we can sanction the death of certain people. Again, very dangerous rhetoric when misused or misquoted, but that is what the Rambam writes in this chapter. He says, by contrast, righteous people are privy to the highest level of divine providence. And he cites as an example our patriarchs. They were privy to complete individual providence in every step of their lives, in every purchase, exchange, and so forth. Man's ability to be saved from calamities is therefore not dependent upon his strength, but rather to their perfection and deficiency. I mean, their nearness to or remoteness from God. As is stated, Raglei Chasidav Yishmor, that God, as it says in the book of Samuel, protects the feet of his saintly ones, Urishaim Bachoshech Yidamu, and the wicked will be lost in the darkness. Kilo Bichalach Yigbarish. Man does not succeed through strength, but rather through divine providence. And this concept, and the more worthy of divine providence a human being is, the more he will succeed in everything in his endeavors in the world today. I am very tempted to make commentary on what is going on in the world today, especially in light of the war in Israel, but I will avoid doing so that we stay focused on the topic at hand. This concept is not only borne by multiple scriptures, but can also be found in the great Islamic philosopher Abu Nasr al-Farabi and by Plato himself. And therefore, the Rambam concludes by saying, consider this chapter as it ought to be considered, for through it, all the fundamental principles of the law will become safe for you and conformable for you to speculative philosophic opinions. Disgraceful views will be abolished, and the form of providence as it is will become clear to you. In other words, in order to be able to appreciate the Torah's whole system of reward and punishment, in order to appreciate the justice of the Torah, there must be a sliding scale of divine providence. And then the Rambam writes in the next chapter, we will return to the topic of divine knowledge, even though this was extensively discussed in chapter 16. The Rambam feels for some reason that he has to go back and sort of reinforce his idea of what God is capable of knowing and that God is omniscient. And I believe the reason why the Rambam is going to revisit this in chapter 19 is because he's just gotten through telling us that God's providence extends more to righteous people, less to unrighteous people, and even less to non-human beings. And as such, one would be tempted to say that God is just ignorant of what's going on in our world. And the Rambam feels, I think he's going to demonstrate, that nothing could be further from the truth. And therefore, just give me one second. And therefore, that's the reason why the Rambam is going to return to this chapter. Now, I do want to finish off our chapter with one more commentary, and that is the commentary of Rabbeinu Bechaya on Parshat Vayera that we're going to be reading shortly, where you find that God says, I feel that I need to tell Avraham about what I'm going to do to the people of Sodom. Ki yadativ, because I know that he's going to give charge to his future progeny about the ways of God. And it is here where both Nachmanides, the Ramban, and his student Rabbeinu Bechaya launch into a discussion of divine providence. And I think just for brevity, we'll just take a look at the Rabbeinu Bechaya, which may be somewhat reminiscent of what we saw in the Radak. He says, V'tzarich shetaskil. It's important to know, ki hahashkacha ba'olam hashafel b'min ha'adam hi klalit upratit, that divine providence, as it applies to the human condition, is both general and specific. What he means by that is to say that human beings can be privy to both individual providence and to, excuse me one second, is privy to both individual providence and to general providence. And what that means is, very much like what the Rambam had said, is that some people will be privy to, righteous people will be privy to very, very attentive providence, and other people will be only privy to general providence because God is not as concerned or attentive or interventive into their lives. So here Rabbeinu Bechaya tries to sort of crystallize the definition of that. He says, Upasuk malehu shematzinu. We know this from scripture because it says in Jeremiah, Gadol ha'etza v'rav ha'aliliyah asher einecha pekuchot al kol darkei b'nei adam latet leish kidrachav. That it is clear, says Jeremiah, that you are quite aware, O God, your eyes are open, so to speak, about all the ways of man. Uvisha'ar ba'alei chayim hi klalit lo pratit. But with other creatures, other than human beings, God's providence is only general providence and not specific providence. Rak bichlal kedei lekayem hamin, and therefore God's providence only extends to the maintenance of the species. V'hahashgacha pratit shebemin ha'adam nechleka lishnei chalakim. But we also have to point out that the special providence, that individual providence that man is privy to, is divided into two types. Hashgacha bo leida kol pratei ma'asav u'machshavotav. The one type of providence is where God is aware of everything that man does and everything that man thinks. But then there's a second kind of providence, which we would call an interventive providence. V'hashgacha bo lahagin alav ulahatzilo min hamitkatrigim. The other kind of providence is to protect man and to save him from his oppressors. Hahashgacha bo leida kol pratei ma'asav hi b'chol adam miyisrael o min ha'umot. He says the type of divine providence of the first kind, which is where God is aware of everything that man does and thinks, is universal to every single human being. God is aware of what every person is doing and thinking. Ki inyan shekatuv hayotzer yachad libam hamevino kol ma'asehem. That God sort of forms all together the hearts of men and understands and discerns everything they do collectively. But, in other words, God has the same level of knowledge of every single human being as the other. But hashgacha bo lahatzilo min hamikrim, but God's divine providence as it applies to being interventive in man's life, to save him from his oppressors, ein ze b'chol adam va'afilu b'Yisrael. This is a sliding scale. This will depend upon a person's righteousness. Im batzadikim shebahem shahakadosh baruch hu matzil et hatzadikim in hamikrim sheshar b'nei adam nimsarim biyadam. He says sometimes there will be no difference between a Jew and a non-Jew in this respect, because it really rather depends upon righteousness. The righteous ones are those whom God will save from all of those kinds of situations in life where, a person was about to cross the street and a drunk driver was coming along. God will intervene and make sure that the tzaddik is not hit by the car of the drunk driver. V'lo ya'azov et chasida v'lo yigra mehem eino. God therefore will not withhold his eye from such a righteous person because of his greatness. God will have certain personal attentive intervention in that person's life. That God's providence does not depart from that person ever. And that's why God says about Abraham that I know him. That God says, I am here to be involved in Avraham Avinu's life at every step of the way. I will always be saving him. And that's the same opinion of Nachmanides when you look at his commentary, which we won't go into today. The point that I want to make is that sort of both the Ramban and Rabbeinu Bechaya crystallize what the Rambam is talking about. When we talk about hashgacha or providence, we saw that the Rambam has a differentiation between divine knowledge and divine providence. Rabbeinu Bechaya calls them both hashgacha, but he says there's two types of hashgacha. There's God's sentience and omniscience, his knowledge of whatever is going on among human beings. Every single thing is recorded, every single thought is recorded, and God is aware of what every single human being is doing, whether they are righteous, whether they are not righteous. But as far as the hashgacha of divine intervention in people's lives, that is the sliding scale that the Rambam is talking about over here. And so it's very important to know that, and that's perhaps the reason why the Rambam says, I will need to, in chapter 19, return to the discussion of divine knowledge so that a person not confuse the two different types of hashgacha that Rabbeinu Bechai is talking about. Just because a person may be intellectually limited and therefore not as privy to divine intervention does not in any way imply that God is more ignorant, so to speak, of that person's life or what they are doing or thinking on a daily basis. And I think that's really the point that I would like to end with, is that each person's hashgacha is unique as far as how much God chooses to intervene and be mindful and protective of that person's life. But God's mindfulness of every single human being is universal and does not change from one human being to the other. As far as God's mindfulness on every single blade of grass, every single insect, and every single animal, it is clear that according to both the Ramban and the Rambam and a number of other commentaries, that God's even knowledge of those creatures is not even present. But it could be that one way of reconciling the difference between what we've seen in the Radak, in Hasidic thought, and the Vilna Gaon says the same thing as well, is perhaps they're talking about God's knowledge of every single blade of grass, not his divine intervention into every single blade of grass. So as you can see, sometimes the terminology gets a little bit in the way of us getting to a greater understanding, but bear in mind that there's a variety of discussion on this topic. And we'll hold it here for today, and I hopefully will be able to continue next week. So I hope this was helpful to understand a little bit better the idea of hashgacha, of divine providence. Have a great week, everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
Thank you.